We're all connected now more than ever, and with that comes the risk of our personally identifiable information getting into the wrong hands. These thieves can then use your information to fraudulently open credit accounts and obtain money, goods, services at your expense. There's also the risk of identity thieves obtaining employment, medical treatment, government benefits, or even hiding from law enforcement using your identity, creating a situation that costs you money, time, and stress to fix. So how do we keep our information out of the wrong hands? Let's start by understanding what exactly personally identifiable information includes. The most valuable information to an identity thief is a person's name in combination with their social security number and date of birth. Typically, this information never changes and is all an identity thief needs to use to open a fraudulent account, such as credit cards, vehicle purchases, and even payday loans. But it doesn't stop there. Scammers also use your name in combination with your driver's license number, passport number, account PIN numbers, passwords, even biometric data such as your DNA, facial recognition, or any other unique physical representation. Pretty intense, huh? It can be, especially if any of your information falls into the wrong hands. But here are some simple steps you can take to help safeguard your personally identifiable information while connected online. Develop strong internet security practices. Take an inventory of web-connected devices in your apartment or home, such as gaming devices, smartwatches, smart TVs, routers, and voice assistants like Google Home and Amazon Alexa. And of course, computers and phones. Then install and update firewall, virus, and spyware protection. Make sure you keep these devices updated and pay attention to security warnings. Be cautious of pop-up ads or links in emails. Do not open attachments from people that you don't know. Even emails that appear to be from friends or legitimate companies could be imposters trying to steal your information. When in doubt, call to verify that the email is real before you open it. Use strong passwords or passphrases. Strong passwords and passphrases should be easy for you to remember, but difficult for someone else to guess. Use a long string of numbers, symbols, uppercase, lowercase letters, and never include any of your personal information in a password. Change your passwords often, and never share them with anyone. Consider using a password manager that acts as a vault for passwords on your devices while helping you keep track of different passwords for each account. Always log out of your accounts before you shut down your computer. Leaving a computer on is an invitation to hackers. Turn on two-factor authentication when it's offered. This provides an extra layer of security that combines something that you have, like a physical token, such as a card or code, with something you know or have memorized, such as a PIN or password. Manage your online profiles and utilize the privacy settings that are available. Never post any personally identifiable information in your online profiles, including photos of important documents. If you post too much information about yourself, an identity thief can use it to answer challenge questions about your account and get access to your money and personal information, and even reach out to friends and family to create fake emergencies to get money on your behalf. Understand how your mobile payment apps work. Mobile payment apps let you send money to people right from your phone. But did you know that some apps are more secure than others? Some transactions are private and safe, while other transactions may be displayed on public social feeds. Do your research and choose a payment app where all payment information is encrypted and shared securely with company servers. Also remember that the funds in the payment app account are not usually protected by your financial institution, which means that you're maybe out of luck if you transfer money to a scammer. Scammers use mobile payment services to trick people into sending money for merchandise that's never delivered. Protect yourself and your money by using mobile payment services with family, friends, and others that you know and trust. In addition to securing your personally identifiable information, you should monitor your finances so that you can respond quickly to fraudulent activities. Check your credit reports. Checking your credit report often is one of the best ways to detect identity theft. You can request a free credit report from all 3 credit reporting agencies by calling toll-free 877-322-8228 or online at www.annualcreditreport.com. If you notice anything suspicious or unfamiliar with your credit report, contact the Bureau of Consumer Protection at 1-800-422-7128 for information on how to file a complaint. Review your bank statements and bills, medical statements regularly. Unfamiliar information on your monthly statements could be a sign that you're the victim of identity theft. Monitor your bills and bank statements for unauthorized charges as soon as they arrive. Report any issues as soon as possible. Checking them online often can alert you even sooner. If your bill or statement does not come at the normal time, call and ask about it, since late arrival could be another indication of identity theft. Request a Social Security statement, which shows a list of your annual earnings by year. If your annual earnings on this report do not match what you earned for that year, someone may be using your Social Security number for employment. You can get your Social Security statement by creating an account at ssa.gov. Taking the steps to secure your personally identifiable information while online will help keep you and your personal information safe. Find additional resources for consumers on the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection website, where you can find detailed fact sheets on a wide variety of topics. Enroll in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on social media. More resources are available on the Consumer Protection 101 webpage at www.datcp.wi.gov.